can you ensure that there are limitations that Saudi Arabia is maybe enriching uranium for its civilian nuclear program during the day, but at night, how do we know and ensure that there's not nuclear enrichment for weapons?
You have the complicating factor with President Trump, then less than a day after the original deal was announced, suddenly saying that the agreement was contingent on Saudi Arabia signing up to the Abraham Accords.
I think if he were to accomplish that, the White House would really point to that and say that, look, President Trump has really transformed the Middle East. Hey guys, great to see you. Somewhat eventful week here in Washington.
It's never not eventful, isn't it? I mean, it's nearly more noteworthy if we had a quiet and boring week. But as journalists, we're not begging for that either. Sure, we're not.
Still hasn't happened this administration.
No, and I thought we would end up talking again about the Iran war this week, but instead, this is a really good opportunity to get into a really big piece of news this week with massive implications for the US, for the Middle East, for its allies in the Middle East, and that is this agreement, as we understand, it still stands between the US and Saudi Arabia for nuclear cooperation.
Yeah, this was something that had been kind of well leaked, hadn't it, towards the start of the week. And actually, it's something that the Americans have been working on for years, which is the idea of a commercial agreement between US companies and Saudi Arabia to help them with their nuclear energy capabilities. We're told, and President Trump has stressed this a few times this week now, that it's a civilian deal. So it's for energy, it's to power the grid. But of course, the opponents of the deal have major concerns that this would actually give Saudi Arabia the capabilities to develop a nuclear weapon for themselves, which would be a big problem for many people in the region and here in the US. And then you have the complicating factor with President Trump, then less than a day after the original deal was announced, suddenly saying that the agreement was contingent on Saudi Arabia signing up to the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, of course, being that signature piece of policy of deals from the first Trump administration, which relates to having normalized relations with Israel. So in this case, between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that is something that they have sworn, until now anyway, not to do.
I think it's worth pointing out that the argument for a long time among many here in Washington against helping Saudi Arabia with a nuclear energy program was that it could, in theory, prompt a nuclear race with its main regional rival, Iran. And obviously, Iran's nuclear program is now at almost the focus of everything where the U.S. is doing in that country. But also there is kind of the added question of the long term stability of Saudi Arabia. I mean, at the moment, for example, Israel and Saudi Arabia, they don't have relations, but things aren't tense out, at least publicly. I think in the future, there's always the concern that this could have kind of very serious implications for Israel's security. And it's worth pointing out that Israel has in the past taken steps to strike nuclear facilities in Iraq and Syria. This is clearly something that I think will perhaps go down badly in some quarters in Israel.
Yeah, if we take a step back, this is not a new consideration by Washington. I mean, the Biden administration, I was watching some of the former Biden administration officials talking about the news of this agreement, and they said this is something that had been considered and talked about with Saudi Arabia when President Biden was in office as well, and that these considerations have gone back around 10 years or so at least, that the US has considered this type of civilian nuclear cooperation with Saudi Arabia. And it's also important to note that the US does have an agreement with the UAE, right? So a civilian nuclear agreement with the United Arab Emirates. So it's not unprecedented in the region, but that agreement with the UAE came with specific limitations, restrictions to ensure that it is just a civilian nuclear program. And there was concern that this agreement, framework agreement, would not have the same limitations. And then, you have allies in the region like the UAE unhappy about perhaps the deal they got versus Saudi Arabia. And all of this now, as you've said, Katrina, called into question by President Trump linking it to the Abraham Accords. The UAE and Bahrain were the two Arab states that signed on to the Abraham Accords in President Trump's first administration. And for a long time, this has been for him, would be, the central jewel in his crown to have Saudi Arabia sign on to it as well. And the key point there is that the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, has made clear, as have his allies in the region, that that would be contingent upon. So his approval of normalizing relations with Israel is contingent upon there being a pathway to a Palestinian state. So all of this linked, it's extremely complicated, and yet, really has made big waves.
And I think it's also important to note that one of the reasons Saudi Arabia didn't join the Abraham Accords in the first place was that, admittedly, public opinion in Saudi Arabia wasn't particularly in favor of doing so. And if anything, that's gotten worse as a result of the war in Gaza. And it's really not clear from what the White House has said so far why they believe that assessment changed. Of course, we don't know that the Saudis are going to immediately agree to this, but it seems there had been some sort of shift. On the other hand, I think some people are already theorizing that the Abraham Accords announcement, which came a day after the nuclear announcement, is in a way kind of it hits the brakes on the whole thing for a while that settles, because he was getting quite a lot of pushback even before the formal announcement.
And just another point of history, very recent history, Israel and Saudi Arabia were making good progress towards signing the Abraham Accords in the immediate period preceding the October 7th attacks. And there's some analysis in some quarters that perhaps the timing of those attacks by Hamas was because of how close those Abraham Accords were to being signed. And obviously, since then, the public mood in Saudi Arabia has really soured towards Israel, to how that whole conflict and occupation has been handled in the intervening period. So at this point, it seems very hard to see how Saudi Arabia can sign up to those Abraham Accords, even if they're linked to this nuclear deal, which is something that they are in favor of. And as you said there, the key point is missing from that agreement, insofar as we are aware at this point, is any restriction on using the technology and using the facilities to enrich nuclear material to have a nuclear weapon. So it seems on the face of it that it's a very different agreement to the one that exists with the UAE. And the other point, of course, is not just the regional opposition, but it's the opposition to it here in the US. Speaking to people during the week about this, the kind of prevailing attitude seemed to be, oh yeah, from an economic point of view, from an energy point of view, this is quite a good deal. But from a national security point of view, perhaps less so, and very much pointing to those grey areas of what we don't know about the deal, what's going on behind the scenes. Mohammed bin Salman, obviously incredibly close to the Trump family, not just the president, but in particular the sons in the Trump family. They've got a lot of business deals in Saudi Arabia. They're quite friendly and so on. And a lot of question marks about, why now with this deal at a point when the US is also escalating its attacks on Iran, and what else is contained in here that we just don't know about at this point.
The White House has been very kind of careful to frame it as an America First announcement. During the press briefing with Caroline Levitt, for example, she said this opens things up for American companies and American investment in Saudi Arabia, and therefore it's good for America. So I think for them, it was really important to sell this as a domestic win, but they kind of, at least in the briefing so far, they really glossed over the national security implications of it. And there is still a lot of anti-Saudi sentiment among some on Capitol Hill. I mean, I think quite a few lawmakers are openly critical of Saudi Arabia, not just its human rights record, but its previous history, going all the way back to September 11th. And I think there's a lot of kind of lingering animosity in some corners of Congress against Saudi Arabia that I think the administration is now going to have to contend with.
Yeah, I think that also points to what the Trump administration would say is a lack of an ability to accept just, who the US's allies in the region are right now. And they very much see this Trump administration, Saudi Arabia, as a steadfast ally there. I mean, Katrina, you mentioned President Trump's own family business dealings with Saudi Arabia. But President Trump seems to really like Mohammed bin Salman. He's someone he kind of counts on as an ally and partner in the region. He was really blown away by his trip there in May of 2025, if I'm remembering the exact dates correctly, in mid-May of 2025. And there does seem to be a real willingness from President Trump, even if the Abraham Accords don't end up being part of this agreement if it goes ahead. The U.S., as you said, Bernie, they see the Trump administration sees the U.S. as really gaining because it offers business opportunities for U.S. companies, and also Saudi Arabia wants us obviously to be able to develop its civilian nuclear program. I think part of the hesitation that I've seen is we understand that there are two side letters that are part of this agreement that are classified, and the administration says that these are classified because they deal with national security issues and proprietary business issues. But a lot of lawmakers I've seen are asking, okay, what has been agreed to? What's in these side letters? And can you ensure that there are limitations that Saudi Arabia is maybe enriching uranium for its civilian nuclear program during the day, but at night, how do we know and ensure that there's not nuclear enrichment for weapons happening at another period of time? All of this will be contingent upon really the fine letters of any agreement.
And what we also don't know to that point is, are there details or clauses requiring inspections of whatever program Saudi Arabia might develop, that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, would come in at periodic intervals to inspect them, as they do. That's in the UAE contract, that what they do is inspected. And of course, much of the problems with Iran have come from the fact that they have denied access to those inspectors, particularly when the JCPOA deal was broken off. So we don't have an explicit statement that those inspections are required in the parts of the deal that are made public. There is some reporting in the US that some of what's in those letters actually exempts Saudi Arabia from those inspections. So that would clearly be a big problem for some of those who are opposed to this deal. And we have to remember that this deal goes to Congress for approval. So they do have a role here. Obviously, the president has sought to kind of go around them on some other policy matters, but they do have a role here. The question being, which members would put their money where their mouth is and might privately say they're against this deal, but would they be prepared to stand up and oppose it?
I also think on a more kind of personal level for President Trump, he really needs this foreign policy victory at a time. The memorandum of understanding with Iran as things stand isn't going well. He often says he's brought, eight conflicts to a close, which is obviously a very debated topic. And this really would be kind of, I think, in the eyes of the White House, the crowning foreign policy achievement of both his terms. I mean, to certain extent, even the Abraham Accords in his first term was kind of considered the biggest foreign policy achievement, because just a few years ago, that was kind of unthinkable. When I lived in the UAE, for example, not that long ago, 6, 7 years ago, that Israel was not something that people even spoke about. It just was kind of an unspoken, completely unspoken spot on the map. And I think if he were to accomplish that, the White House would really point to that and say that, look, President Trump has really transformed the Middle East. Look how it was 20 years ago versus how it is now.
I think that's a really important point about wanting this foreign policy win, Bernie, because this is coming at a time where we're seeing the Iran war escalate to a point where it's not clear if it's really under control anymore at all. I've spoken to a number of analysts who are saying both sides don't want to get back into a full out war, and yet they can't seem to control this ladder of escalation. And you have Iran increasingly hitting those Gulf allies, Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan as well, an important US ally in the region. And so for President Trump to be able to say, look, this is a sign of our strong partnership with the Gulf at a time where they might be increasingly frustrated with the US as well, is a significant one. And, just seeing more polling out this week, just underlining again, coming back to the situation here in the US, how unpopular this war is.
Indeed, and that position hasn't changed at all, has it, since the end of February? There's been no sort of turning point in this war that has managed to sway popular opinion in any shape or form. And with the escalation that we've seen in the last week and a half or so, it looks like it's even getting worse. We're likely to start seeing the oil prices, the gas prices going back up again. But I don't know whether the electorate are kind of more nuanced in their thinking than that a deal done with Saudi Arabia doesn't change any of that for them. I think people would kind of set aside the Saudi deal insofar as it impacts in the short term anyway real people's lives, because all of these deals would take a while to put into motion. Any production or manufacturing would take a while. Those investments that may in fact come after Donald Trump has left office for this term. So but as always, we have a lot of grey areas in what we're being told, and we're trying to kind of weave our way through it, aren't we?
We'll have plenty to talk about with this topic for the foreseeable future, I think. I think the Saudi thing
Yes,
will continue for a while.
yes, for sure.
Well, I guess that's all we have time for this week, guys, but great to see you.
You too. Talk soon.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.